And at this time, I'd like to introduce John Reiskind, who will introduce our session for today. Thank you.
Yes, this is the beginning of 6 sessions. I want to welcome the participants that are focused on the 6 Nobel Prizes that are given each fall in the first week of October. And actually, by the end of our sessions, I'll give you a little bit, at the last lecture, a little bit more about the mechanics of the Nobel Prize, for those who don't know how they're chosen and how they're presented. The order of these talks have to do with the availability of speakers. And so I'm very pleased that literature, which came last year, comes first this year. And we're very lucky to have Apollo Amoko, an associate professor at the Department of English here, who will be our first speaker, a very apropos speaker. He got his Bachelor of Arts at Kenyatta University in Kenya and did his Masters of Art at 2 institutions, I guess in English, at the University of Alberta in Canada and the University of Michigan, where he went on to receive his PhD in English languages and literature. And that's where my son got his PhD, University of Michigan. So I'm proud to root for them. He has joined the University of Florida's Department of English in 2002. So we celebrate the 20th anniversary of this. His research interests are African literature, post-colonial theory and literature, critical theology and modern drama. And we welcome you today. And I'm not going to take any much more of my time. And you have the audience. Apollo.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and for the introduction, John. A couple clarifications. The first MA was in theater. In my misguided youth, I was an actor. And you're the second person who's introduced me with information lifted from the website, which has now convinced me that there's an error thanks to my dyslexia. The field is critical theory, not critical theology, but you're the second person who said that, so the fault is mine. So thank you all. I am going to offer some remarks about Abdulrazak Gurnah. Sorry, I anglicized his name, Gurnah. And first I'll give you a sense of my presentation. I'll make some introductory or preliminary remarks, then I'll try and situate him within the field of African and post-colonial studies. And along the way, I'll be talking about several of his novels, in particular, a novel called Paradise, which is his most widely read and widely cited novel that was published in 1994. So to begin with, and I have to say, I confess to a certain nervousness because I do not know very much about the audience and what their backgrounds are. So at the risk of making some obvious statements, I'm going to be erring on the side of over-explaining rather than under-explaining, but I'll make the presentation intellectually substantive, even for people who have some background in African and or post-colonial studies. So to begin with a few preliminary remarks, I can't help but remark at the oddity that two Scandinavian countries have come to wield such outsized influence in world culture, so that the awards they give are considered the pinnacle of intellectual achievement or cultural achievement. And the processes they use are kind of closed in a mysterious black box. And clearly some of their choices tend to be very inspired. Some of them tend to be rather dubious or questionable. For instance, as much as I admire Barack Obama, John and I were talking about how the Nobel Prize he was awarded was a dubious distinction because, as he himself put it, he hadn't done anything. And as much as they said it was aspirational, it then was supremely ironic that the lecture he gave in accepting the award was an astonishingly militaristic speech. And I think too that there must be some embarrassment that the Nobel Prize for Literature was once awarded to Winston Churchill and other dubious distinctions. Anyway, with those remarks, the award to Abdulrazak Gurnah was somewhat surprising. It took a lot of people by surprise. And he is the 5th writer from Africa to have received the Nobel Prize for Literature. The first being Wole Soyinka of Nigeria, who got the award in 1986. The others being Nadine Gordimer and J.M. Coetzee of South Africa, and Najib Mahfouz of Egypt. So East Africa felt that the Nobel Prize was long overdue in terms of region. But the money would have been on one of Gurnah's colleagues and contemporaries, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is much more famous. In fact, I'll call your attention to an article that came out in the New York Times in October 27th of 2021 that was titled, "He Won the Nobel, Why Are His Books So Hard to Find?" And I'll just read you the first paragraph. When Abdulrazak Gurnah released his 10th book, Afterlives, last year, his editor was sure that it would become his first major bestseller. For more than 3 decades, he has drawn stellar reviews, but never gained a large readership. And the article goes on to explain that even after he got his Nobel Prize, his books continued to be very hard to find, in part because many of them had gone out of print, but in part also because of the supply chain issues in the wake of the pandemic. So with those preliminary remarks, I'll turn my attention to the first handout that I gave. That's John, that's the one with the list of authors, if you can share your screen. All right, so what I'm trying to do in the next bit of my presentation is to first I'll talk about concepts. So that's right at the bottom of the handout. And there are what I'm considering to be foundational concepts that help situate the world in which Abdulrazak Gurnah functions. And obviously my discussion of the concepts is going to be necessarily abbreviated, and they're also going to be partial in both senses of the word. First, that is, they'll be incomplete, but they'll also be partisan in ways that betray my own intellectual formation and biases. And that's kind of an important point because one way one can think of Abdulrazak Gurnah's work is that they are historical fictions, and especially paradise in ways that I'll be talking about momentarily, that are also self-consciously partial, that he realizes that his imaginative reconstruction of the history of Zanzibar or Tanzania are going to be necessarily incomplete. So in all of his novels, in particular Paradise, within the narrative of the novel, there is storytelling and a conversation about the license and limits of storytelling and so on. So the one concept that I really want to underline, which I think is in my opinion, at the very heart of postcolonial studies, is the notion of the palimpsest. And the palimpsest, the term comes from ancient writing, when ancient writing in papyrus, and papyrus was extremely hard to produce and expensive. And so there was reuse of papyrus. When a piece of writing had become obsolete, they would try and erase it, and they would write, the new writing would be, they would write new scripts on top of it. And what the palimpsest refers to is that the erasures were not so total that it's now possible, if one looks at them very, very carefully, to have a sense of what the original writing said. And the notion of palimpsest is beyond that literal historical context. It's also a kind of figuratively important notion. So one quick example that I can give is in ancient writing, before Christianity cohered into an orthodox doctrine, there were plural Christianities, many of which were subsequently denounced as heresies. And the writing of those thinkers has generally been lost to history, either because they were maliciously destroyed by the people who won the ideological debate and established Christian doxa, or because they were simply not reproduced. However, scholars have been able to piece it together by reading the ways in which the writings that survive describe and denounce what they consider heresies, so that there's a kind of palimpsest there. And it seems to me that palimpsest is at the heart of postcolonial studies, because what it's dealing with is the process of cultural interaction amid often asymmetrical power relations. And at the heart of the palimpsest is that when a new culture is imposed, the old culture does not become totally eradicated, and traces of it continues to exist and to exert themselves even in the present. And this becomes important in terms of, first, let me explain the second concept, cross-cultural intertextuality. And this is that no writing emerges as in a vacuum, but it makes both conscious or unconscious references to prior writings, prior histories, and that postcolonial texts are necessarily intertextual in complicated ways that hark back to the palimpsestic nature of postcolonial studies. I realized I didn't quite give an example of the palimpsest, but what comes off the top of my head is and I'll elaborate this more in detail, the history of Zanzibar includes interactions with Arabs and Persians going back to at least the 10th century. And then it includes periods of it being a colony of Oman, and then Portugal, and then Britain, and so on. And that all of these layers of imperial contact are implicated in Gurnah's writing. Now, Atlantic studies are put there because I think it's something that more people will be familiar with than Indian Ocean studies. And to give a simplistic definition, Atlantic studies is part of, one way of thinking about it, it's a way of conceiving of culture beyond the confines of the boundaries of the nation state. In other words, it's a way of rejecting the nationalist history of nationalism, which makes it seem like all roads lead toward the nation state. One of the critics I've listed is Weiche Denmark, who in an essay called Literature for the Planet calls for the liberation of literature from the tyranny of numbers, whether those numbers are latitudes and longitudes or historical dates. And her point is that books that are separated by vast distances in terms of space and time can be more closely related to each other than books that are created within the same geographical confines and at the same historical conjecture. So what Atlantic studies looks at the Atlantic as a conceptual framework for understanding relations of trade, the relations of colonial conquests, the circulation of ideas, the circulation of goods, the circulation of peoples, including above all the circulation of Black bodies, and the ways in which the Atlantic becomes the discursive zone in which all sorts of ideas and identities are conceived and negotiated. To give you two very quick examples, the dance, the tango, for example, is a formation that begins in the barrios of Argentina as a homosocial dance between men, and is then re-imported back to Spain, where it becomes this aristocratic heterosexual dance that is then exported to the world. Or to give another example that's somewhat contested, Benedict Anderson, the great theorist of nationalism, in a book called Imagined Communities, makes the claim that the idea of the nation state is first formulated and instituted in the New World, and the United States is he argues that the United States is the first nation state in the world, and then the idea is exported across the Atlantic back to Europe, where the idea of the nation state replaces older forms of organizings, principally dynastic realms and religious communities. And again, to underline the notion of the palimpsest, these older forms of organizing are not erased by the formation of the nation state, but find ways to coexist and continue to exert huge influence. With that all too brief summary, the Indian Ocean Studies is an attempt to make the same kind of intellectual leap with respect to parts of East Africa, the Arab world, India, and so on, and to say that instead of thinking about this as geographically isolated communities, to pay attention to the fact that the Indian Ocean provided a way of establishing contact, mediating things. So as I emphasized, as I stated a while back, and we'll come to again, the Zanzibar has a history of contact with India and Persia and the Arab world that goes back to the 10th century and arguably much earlier. And there are, for example, communities in, and this contact is not restricted to the coastal communities alone, because the trade and movements of people, including slave trade, went deep into the African interior, some of it as far as the Congo. And Zanzibar was a major trade, was heavily implicated in the slave trade. I'll come back to that in a little bit. All this is very powerfully reimagined and creatively reimagined in Gurnah's Paradise as a paradigmatic example. And but the point I was going to make is that there are communities in the heart of Tanzania that are regarded as indigenous African communities that historically were formed, included wide intermarriage with Arab and Persian traders. But those Arab and Persian traders, it was so long ago that they have quote unquote become thoroughly indigenized, and they are considered native African, though as Gurnah very insightfully points out, traces of their Persian heritage survive. And the reason why this is extremely important is that there is a danger, even with regard to post-colonial studies, to retain a certain Eurocentrism, even as post-colonial studies is ostensibly about contesting Eurocentrism. And I can make this concrete using Paradise, the novel. The critical analysis of Paradise is retains a truly disturbing Euro-centered perspective, so that even though occasionally critics will make brief references to the fact that the book also includes discussions about the Indian Ocean and that dimension, it's not much explored. And a lot of the criticisms of the novel seem to be overdetermined by assumptions that privilege Europe. So for example, any number of critics refer to the book in terms of being a post-colonial rewriting of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. For reasons I'll explain in a minute, that reading is quite questionable, if not entirely dubious. It seems to be based on the superficial observation that both Heart of Darkness and Paradise are centered around journey motifs that begin from an African coast into the African interior. Now, it bears emphasizing that Joseph Conrad is, there are several post-colonial African texts that are in fact in intertextual engagement, critical intertextual engagement with Conrad's texts. For example, Chenua Achebe's paradigmatic Things Fall Apart, which I'll come to in momentarily, as well as a novel by a writer named, a Sudanese writer called Tayeb Saleh, that's called Season of Migration to the North, which quite clearly is in intertextual conversation with Conrad's text, as well as William Shakespeare's Othello. So in many ways, I realize I did not talk about discourse and discussivity, so I'll just briefly interrupt this to talk about them. I'm using these terms in the ways intended by the French critic philosopher Michel Foucault, where discourse is simply talk, and we are talking about the rules that govern the kind of talk that comes to be taken seriously. And what I'm interested in is there are certain figures who emerge not just to be participants in particular intellectual debates, but the people who frame the terms in which that debate is constructed. In Foucault's example, Freud and Marx, founders of discussivity, so that they have so framed the terms in which debate is constructed that so much that even people who have not read or may not consciously know of them, nevertheless talk in terms that hark back to these founders of discussivity. If I can make a mischievous point, no one more powerfully exemplifies Marx's notion of the existential contest between capital and labor than right-wing Republican politicians, even as they actively disavow Marxism in stringent and anti-intellectual terms. They nevertheless talk resolutely in terms of class struggle, except that they are always in favor of the owners of capital rather than the labor. And in the point, the reason I made that detour is, I think, for good or for ill, Joseph Conrad is a founder of discussivity when it comes to African literature specifically, and post-colonial literature more generally. But it is easy to overstate his centrality and his importance. And a more useful way of thinking about the intertextual conversation or the intertextuality that is implicated in a novel like Paradise is the history of cross-cultural contact that has very little to do with European colonialism in the 18th century. And this is not the only instant where Joseph Conrad is invoked as the figure that's at the heart of an African author's imagination that is dubious. There is a South African writer by the name of Zex Mda. I'm just sending on the chart a list of additional names that I meant to include in the handout I sent, but I had forgotten. Zex Mda is arguably the most influential post-apartheid novelist and author of such books as Ways of Dying and The Whale Caller. And he has a novel called The Heart of Redness, which refers to this episode in the 19th century South Africa, where a prophetess led her people to drive themselves and their cattle to the ocean, into the Indian Ocean, because somehow this was supposed to bring to an end the colonial oppression. And any number of critics call the book rewriting of Heart of Darkness. And the author has been very furious in refuting that and saying that the term comes from a specific, very popular Hausa saying that readers, that the critics and readers in the West seem to overlook because the ghost of Conrad haunts African literature in ways that are overdetermined. Now, to come to the list of the authors that are put there, and I'm trying to situate Gurnah in the context of African literature. So I want to talk about the list of the first list of authors: Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Wole Soyinka, Chenua Achebe, Sheikh Hamidou Khan, Flora Nwapa. I'm calling them the first generation of post-colonial African writers. These are writers who were born in late colonial Africa and came of age right after the Second World War, when it had become clear that the colonial project in Africa was over. And the only question at hand was how Europe was going to disarticulate itself from Africa. And these are authors who came of age at a time of great optimism in the continent, where there was a perception that the continent was on the eve of being. So these are writers who are talking about between the late 1950s and to the late 1960s. What I'm calling the second generation, if I'm just to zoom out and give a broader context before I come back and elaborate the first generation, implicates writers like Yambo Oluguem from Mali, Aikwei Ama from Ghana. I'm calling them second generation African writers. These are novels that were written, say, from the late 1960s to the 1970s. And on the chart, I have sent additional examples of authors. These include Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Yaya Gayeshi, that's supposed to be as S, not as E, Gayeshi, Yvonne Awor, Adhiambo Awor of Kenya, and Uwam Akban from Nigeria, who has just been hired, Zex Mda, not Makes Mda, damn autocorrect.
We missed just a word or two, but just as you were finishing talking about the third generation.
All right, so that generation of writers are people who are writing, who came of age in post-colonial Africa, and they are writing post-1980, 1980 and following. But to come to back to the first generation, I was saying that they came of age at an era of highly optimistic anti-colonial nationalism, where the continent felt that it was being, relieving itself of the yoke of colonialism, and was on the eve of an era of self-determination, prosperity, and so on. So for example, during Jomo Kenyatta's inaugural address in December 1963, when he became the first democratically elected prime minister of post-colonial Kenya, he said that the task of his government is to eradicate poverty, disease, and ignorance. And these were tasks that the colonial regime had been indifferent to, but would be the priority of the post-colonial regime. These works of art, one could think of them as trying to achieve three discursive or aesthetic goals. And those goals do not necessarily cohere easily. So in the first place, they intended to refute the arguments laid out in what I'm calling the colonial library by asserting the fundamental rationality of pre-colonial African cultures. So if I could use the example of Chenua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, he is at pains to refute the image of Africa that's crystallized in his reading of Conrad, because Conrad's Heart of Darkness is this modernist classic that is actually witheringly anti-imperialist in its critique, using really, really powerful irony. But in Achebe's opinion, despite being anti-imperialist, it's nevertheless racist in its depiction of Africa. His claim is that here is a novel that's set substantially in Africa, actually set overwhelmingly in Africa, in which the African characters have nothing to say, or worse than have nothing to say, they have two sentences, one of which entails them casually discussing the concept of cannibalizing the white explorer in their presence. And so he saw it as his mission to say, those naked Africans you see in the margins of the Conrad's text, they have extremely profound and sophisticated cultures. They are profoundly rational. At the same time, he was also contesting the kind of, if Conrad is kind of the epitome of high literature, he was contesting low literature that was produced by colonial travelers, explorers, missionaries, an example of which would be a popular Christian writer called Joyce Gary, whose novels were framed in the terms of, when I first got to Africa, I thought these people were so irreducibly different from me that we had nothing in common. And they were very strange and exotic with their weird customs. But then after a while, I came to realize that underneath the surface, they were exactly identical to me, and we are all children of God and so on. Sheikh Hamidou Khan has a novel called Ambiguous Adventure. And that is a highly, highly philosophical novel that takes on the racism embedded in European philosophy, such people as Hegel specifically, who writes the philosophy of history and talks about consciousness of spirit, which include, there are four paradigms for him: Greek, Roman, and Oriental, and Africa is excluded. This is a paraphrase that's pretty close to his words. As far as Africa proper is concerned, it is darkness, and darkness is not the subject of history. So the first generation of African authors were really, really concerned with refuting that colonial Africa depiction of Africa. At the same time, however, they were concerned to provide an explanation for how Africa came to be colonized, how a handful of European powers came to exercise dominion over a continent vastly larger than Europe, how Belgium, for example, came to colonize Congo, a territory 10 times its own size. And for someone like Chinua Achebe, it wasn't sufficient to say that they had superior military technology and that there were specific internal weaknesses and contradiction that rendered African polities vulnerable to European colonial expansion. In the Things Fall Apart, he depicts a culture that has become ossified and rigid and uncritical, and is extremely harsh in its treatment of those that it regards as marginal, for example, men who are insufficiently masculine, and a culture that, despite its elaborate and reasonable structures, despite its participatory government and accountable leadership, had lost its capacity to be self-critical, so that contentious and indefensible practices such as infanticide were no longer, there was no room to contest them. And the third thing they do is to try and imaginatively think of a way forward for the African continent in terms of now that the yoke of colonialism is gone. So it is, it's actually a powerful point that Achebe, for example, at a time, the novel was published in 1957, at a time when the continent was kind of drunk in high optimism. He chooses to set the novel a century earlier, at the time that the continent was being colonized. And he sounds this warning caution that if Africa does not learn from its historical mistakes, it's doomed to repeat them. And the novel has come to be read as chillingly prescient in that regard. The second generation, Yambo, one last thing about the first generation is they tend to be overwhelmingly realist novels. Realist novels predicated on linear development along time, and realism, for complicated reasons that I'm happy to discuss at question time, happens also to be the genre of nationalism. Yambo Olugwem published a novel called Bound to Violence in 1969. And this can be considered as the turning point. And from the optimism of the late 50s, these are novels that are characterized by profound pessimism. They can be considered literatures of disillusionment because the promises of independence had not been fulfilled, and many of the oppressive features of the colonial state had been reproduced in the post-colonial regime. And these novels are characterized by various kinds of post-realism. And they are also generally post-nationalist in the sense of they no longer regard the nation state as the foundational site of analysis. Instead, they're driven by what the critic Kwame Anthony Appiah calls the ethical universal, a desire to end or contest human suffering, even when it is justified in the name of national imperatives. The third generation is an intensification of this, and I sometimes refer to them as literatures of crisis. And this is when magical realism, for example, becomes a big presence in African letters. Now, these generations, I'm using them as a heuristic, as a useful way of thinking. One mustn't think of them as very rigid, well-organized categories. For instance, Achebe, Ngugi, and so on have continued writing to this day. Well, Achebe can't be writing because he sadly was recently deceased. And someone like Abdulrazak Gurnah problematizes this paradigms I'm giving because generationally speaking, he belongs to the first generation. He's only 10 years younger than Ngugi wa Thiong'o, but his first novel was not published until 1987. And in one sense, his novels are realist in the way that the first generation novels were, but they are post-nationalist in the ways that the subsequent generations were. And I think I'll stop there and turn to the second handout, which is an essay by Abdulrazak Gurnah himself that I think provides a very quick summary, a very succinct summary of his aesthetic ideology. Yeah, one of the things about presenting the kind of thing that I'm doing in the wake of the internet is that it's not particularly useful for me to give you his biography and his oeuvre, because you can search for that very easily. They are a Bing search away. I've taken to say Bing because I don't want to unwittingly endorse Google anymore. But so I'm not going to tell you his biography, or I'm not going to list his novels and provide summaries of it, but instead we are going to engage this essay in which he talks about his writing. And most of my attention is going to focus on the second page. Mm-hmm. The first page, he's basically explaining how he came to be a writer and how, unlike others, it wasn't a choice that he made until very late in life. Even though it has to be said that from the 1970s, he had become a scholar and a critic of postcolonial and African studies and had taught in several British universities, most particularly the University of Kent, where he taught until his retirement a couple years ago. But on the second page, he begins to talk about how he left Zanzibar and landed in England as a refugee, and how that status as a refugee and a migrant has become central to his imagination. So we'll just pay attention to a couple of the things he says there. The first thing he says that I want to call your attention to is that he left Zanzibar in 1994. Sorry, I take that back, 1964. This is important because he calls it the foundational moment of his formation. 1964 was when there was a communist revolution in the island of Zanzibar, because the first election that was to usher in the post-colonial regime had been rigged. As I'll elaborate in just a minute, Zanzibar has an Arab population that's approximately 20% of the total population, but they exercise undue influence. They exercise the overwhelming influence. Until the revolution, they owned most of the land in Zanzibar, and that particular community is implicated heavily in Zanzibar's slave history, both in terms of importing Africans from what is now from what became Tanganyika to work in the farms in Zanzibar. Zanzibar has been exporting spices to the Arab world and to India for many centuries. And a lot of this was cultivated by slave labor from the 17th century when the territory became an Oman protectorate. And so the Arab population had taken most of the land and they used slave labor, and slave labor was also exported to the Middle East. Even though the African population comprised a majority of the land of the population, they lost the election and the Arab minority was going to exercise a majority in the independent parliament, and that government was toppled in a violent revolution, in the wake of which there were horrific reprisal attacks targeting the privileged Arab aristocracy. It is sharply contested, but anywhere between a few thousand to 20,000 Arabs were massacred. Abdulrazak Gurnah's family is part of the Arab aristocracy, and he fled the island as a 16-year-old to escape that massacre. And as he points out, that has become the foundational moment in his intellectual and aesthetic formation. But then in various of his novels, where, as I said, he is in self-consciously, he believes that storytelling is imperative for us to come to a sense of ourselves as individuals and as individuals embedded in various communities. But he also believes that it's important to relentlessly question the privileged position of the storyteller and the implication of the storyteller in the history that they're trying to tell. And so this moment has become central for him, but as he addresses many of his novels, including a novel called Admiring Silence, locating beginnings is very difficult, because I'll have to say, when I first read the essay, I got to the paragraph when he was talking about the circumstances of how he left Zanzibar. I thought, but why isn't he mentioning why the there was such resentment of the Arab aristocracy. But then in the novel Admiring Silence, he makes a point of questioning beginnings and explaining why notion of beginning is extremely difficult to situate and to locate. And elsewhere in the essay, he goes on to talk, in Writing and Place, he goes on to talk somewhat elliptical terms of the deep racial divisions that helped to explain the genesis of the revolution and the horrific violence that was visited on his Arab family. The other thing I want to emphasize in the essay is his discussion about the position of the migrant or the refugee, and the ways in which he says distance is both empowering because it liberates the writer from the immediacy of the situation that he or she is discussing, in ways that can be extremely insightful, but it also is potentially limiting because the vast conceptual distance, both in terms of time and space, can be distorting, and that his writing is situated in that paradoxical position, in that his status as a migrant or refugee is at once empowering and disempowering. In this regard, his writing is very similar to Salman Rushdie and Amitav Ghosh, who are writers originally from India, and especially Rushdie. Rushdie makes a lot about the notion of the migrant and the centrality of migrancy in contesting the nationalist histories of nationalism. And he's got really compelling trilogy, a book called Shame, Midnight's Children, and the Satanic Verses, that attempt to tell the story of India and Pakistan, first in terms of their colonial history, but also in terms of their situation in an increasingly globalized world. And Rushdie talks about the way the migrant looks at the land they left from fragments of broken mirrors. And I think that's a very felicitous phrase, which also summarizes the ways with which Gurnah re-engages with Zanzibar and Tanzania more generally, that it's looking at them through fragments of broken mirrors. I'm a little uncomfortable at hearing my own voice, so I will stop at this point and I'll happily take your questions.
Very good. This is fascinating to me. I haven't read much post-colonial literature. We have some in the New World as well, from the West Indies and that sort of thing. I should do more of that. He spent his whole life in England, basically his adult life.
Yes.
And University of Kent and all of that. And I'm wondering, does that, freeze his mind in time? Has he visited Africa since? Is he keeping up with it, or is it strictly, he left, I think, when he was 18 years of age?
Yes.
And I'm not sure has he gone back to it? I mean, what sort of relationship does he have with Tanzania and Zanzibar at the present time? Yeah.
He first returned back to Zanzibar in 1984. Mm. So it was 20 years from the time he left to the time he got back for the first visit. Since then, he has gone there regularly. And indeed, I believe he has even taught at some African university for a while. And yeah, but I think the question you're raising is precisely what is at the heart of his own aesthetic ideology, which is to what extent does distance from Zanzibar empower his creative imagination, and to what extent does it distort it? It's an open question. I guess it does a little bit of both. And yeah, I think that's the short answer to the question. I was about to embark on another lecture, but thought the better of it.
Well, we're open to other questions from the group. I realize that almost, I'm sure, with the exception of Dr. Amoko, we have not read this author. I did read some of his. The local library had one of his books, a recent book, and for some reason I never got into it.
If there's no question, there is I have been presenting extemporaneously, and it occurs to me that there's a critical detail that I omitted in my discussion of Paradise, such as it was. I was contesting
Pardon me, I do have one question real quick from our Oak Room here.
Sure.
Okay.
Hi, Apollo. Jean DaCosta.
Hey.
Just a quick, this is not a question, this is a comment. The University of Kent was probably the first British university to develop a department of English that was very interested in post-colonial literature.
Okay.
And in the 1960s, mid and late 60s, early 70s, the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, the Department of English, where I was working, exchanged scholars regularly with that university. So I suspect that Luma may have found an ecological site that was biologically empathetic.
Yes, I think you're exactly right about that. In fact, his master's thesis, which he wrote at Kent, was in African literature. It was a critique on West African literature. So it must have been a nurturing intellectual environment which allowed him to study post-colonial literature at a time when it wasn't necessarily widely taught elsewhere. Mm. But I was going to say, I focused a lot in the critique of the Eurocentrism of the study of the critiques of Paradise, but I meant to give an example of an alternate way of thinking about the novel. And it's clear to me that one of its intertextual references is Islam and the Quran specifically. For example, the protagonist is called Yusuf. And Yusuf is a name that harks back to the Quran, and which itself is harking back to the Hebrew Bible and the book of Genesis and the story of Joseph. In the Quran, the figure of Joseph appears as Yusuf, but it is fundamentally the same story of a child who is favored by the father, and the resentful other brothers sell him to slavery, and he ends up in Egypt, where he comes to rescue his own family and the Hebrews from starvation years later. In Paradise, Yusuf is the child of an African trader who borrows a lot of capital from an Indian merchant who is much more wealthy than he is. And then he cannot pay the capital. And at the age of 6 years, Yusuf is given over as a wage slave by his parents for the debt that they cannot pay. And so the novel is a kind of Bildungsroman where this 6-year-old who is displaced from his home comes to learn about the world, the wider world around him, and the histories of layers of trade relations, colonial relations that implicate, as I say, Persians, Oman, and so on. I will, unlike the Quranic or biblical Joseph or Yusuf, he doesn't come to rescue anybody in the end. The novel ends without much closure. Secondarily, the novel is also, it seems to me, very clearly a revision of the Quran itself, much more than it's a revision of Heart of Darkness, because the man to whom the protagonist is sold is called Uncle Aziz, because the young child is not told that he's being given away to slavery. Instead, he's told that he's being given to his Uncle Aziz. And Uncle Aziz is very transparently a rewriting of Muhammad from the Quran. And it is kind of staggering to me that none of the critical literature mentions this. Why do I say this? Because in the Quran, Muhammad marries Khadija, his first wife, who is 15 years older than him and is a widow and a very, very wealthy and successful trader. Uncle Aziz in Paradise, likewise, marries a very, very wealthy and successful, much older widower. And one of Khadija's wedding gifts to Muhammad at the consummation of the marriage is a young man who is a debt slave. And one of the gifts that the mistress, as she's called in Paradise, gives Uncle Aziz at their wedding is a young debt slave called Khalid. And Khalid and Yusuf are sort of the errands boys / slaves that Uncle Aziz relies on in his various escapades. I could go on, but I've made the point, I hope, that there are more fruitful ways of thinking about the book once one estranges it from a presumption of the centrality of Europe and European colonialism. It's one of the dangers of the way postcolonial studies has come to be as a field in the Anglo-American academy, that it at least unwittingly conceives of European colonialism in the 19th century as the only instance of imperialism. Or the anyway, I'll stop there if there's a question.
Yes, Ron had a question.
I was wondering, you mentioned a number of times how Joseph Conrad's work kind of bounces off what some of these other authors are doing. And Conrad was European, wasn't he?
Yes, he was a Polish immigrant to England.
Mm-hmm. And so how did this comparison come about?
As far as I'm aware, the first time that, you're asking why did African writers start paying attention to him?
Yes, yes.
I think it's because it is one of the most consequential modernist novels, and it was widely read and widely studied. It is substantially set in Africa. I would guess approximately 95% of it occurs in Africa, even though the novel itself is strictly speaking set on the River Thames. And as they're sailing down the Thames, the cat starts reminiscing about his voyage in the Congo. And it is a withering denunciation of Belgian colonialism in the Congo, which was horrifically rapacious. Mm-hmm. They were really rapacious about exploiting the Congo for ivory and rubber, and they used conscripts, and some historians call it a genocide, approximate, and they claim up to 1 million people may have been killed. Because it was such a canonical novel and because it addressed itself to European imperialism in Africa, it came to the attention of a lot of African writers. And then a lot of them became dissatisfied that even as it was critiquing imperialism, it seemed to depict Africa as the passive background for the figuring out of European neuroses.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Achebe himself came to call it racist trash, which is kind of over the top and shocking because he is was an extraordinarily mild-mannered and generous person, but he was so, and I think some of that also just had to do with his own experiences of racism in when he came to the United States and Britain, which sort of colored his perception of the novel.
Sure.
So his essay on Conrad is considered insightful in some ways, but kind of unbalanced.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Was that movie Apocalypse Now about Vietnam, wasn't that modeled
Yes.
after elements of the
Yes.
same novel? So it becomes kind of universal. Incidentally, with your comments on Islam and the parallels of topic, as well as your discussion of early Christianity, I'm not sure critical theology is outside your expertise, frankly.
Thank you.
Very
Now,
interesting.
As I said, I was presenting extemporaneously, so it's now occurring to me I'd not covered something else I meant to cover, which I think is important. Two of the names I put on the list of critics and authors, one is someone called Ade Ajayi, and the other is called V.Y. Mudimbe. And I want to talk about them because they are important in terms of if you are conceiving of Africa as an object of study, there are two competing paradigms or approaches. And again, I'm presenting this less as concrete, rigid, mutually exclusive categories than as heuristics that are good to think with. And the question at the heart of the two approaches is the question of what to make of European colonialism. Ajayi has a very influential essay that's titled Colonialism, an episode in Africa's history. And in that essay, he argues very, very forcefully that as consequential as the European colonization on Africa was, it is possible and indeed frequent to overstate its significance and its significance. And he points out, for example, that European colonialism lasted all of 150 years, and that despite the jingoistic proclamations of the civilizing mission, the colonial state was actually very shallow in its penetration of the African continent. And so he argues that the geographical space we call Africa has a very long and diverse and complicated history prior to European colonialism and a future beyond European colonialism, and without in any way diminishing the consequences of European colonialism, it's important to regard it as an episode in Africa's history. V.Y. Mudimbe is a literary scholar, historian, and he is the author of important books such as The Invention of Africa and The Idea of Africa, in which he argues that it is a fallacy to consider colonialism in terms of how short a duration it lasted. That's short-lived events can be much more consequential than long-lived events. And at its most radical, he argues that the very idea of Africa itself, if one is talking of anything more than a geographical space, is an invention of European colonialism, and that colonialism created nation states where they did not exist before. And sure, they did not erase other forms of organizing, but the fact that I am a native English speaker from a country called Kenya is a manifestation of British colonialism, so that when my more nationalist friends talk about, I am Kenyan and I'm proud, I often mischievously remind them that there was no such thing as Kenya until the British invented it in 1920. And so from a peer's perspective, colonialism is a singularly epochal event in the history of Africa, and it is cannot be characterized as merely an episode. And when I teach my students in African literature, I tell them, here are these arguments, and when I read either one of them, I am completely convinced by them, and they are mutually exclusive of each other. So you make of that what you will.
Yeah. Well, thank you. You know, it's interesting that biologically, physical anthropology, there's greater diversity genetically in Africa than the rest of the world combined.
Yes.
We forget a lot of these things. And then when those people who think Africa is a country, 54
yes.
countries, you know. So anyway, this has been really illuminating, and it's gotten me thinking about a bunch of things. I'm going to go back and try to find Paradise and read it now that you've given me
so if I could, because he's written up to 10 novels, if I could give people recommendations, Paradise would be where I would say to start, but then Admiring Silence, and his latest novel is called Afterlives.
What is it called?
Afterlives, Lives.
Afterlives, yes, okay. Good, thank you.
Thank you. This was
and
great
thanks
fun.
for doing this. I appreciate it, and good luck. And I see your wife is here, which is real nice. How are you, Leah?
And my mother-in-law is also here.
Oh, really? Good. Oh, there.
Alvia.
Small world. Well, thank you very much. And you'll have to, I've forgotten, the next 3 lectures are on the sciences in order. And so we'll all hopefully learn a great deal as well. And so we'll see you next week, same place, same time. Thank you, Julianne. That was great. And sorry, I kind of muted myself early and I didn't realize it. Anyway.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you everyone for listening to me.
Thank you for being with us, Dr. Amoko. Stay well, everyone.
Thank you.